Okay, I am with Maggie Menane. Did I say your last name right? I didn't. I screwed it up.
It fuzzed out anyway, so it
Okay,
just sounded
great.
like murmur.
Yes, perfect. All right. So Maggie, tell us a little bit about your writing. Where are you at in your writing journey? What are you working on? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so old person, new writer.
Nice.
I didn't, I hear all these stories about people like, I've been writing since I was 5 years old. I'm like, yeah, I didn't start writing till I was 50.
Yeah.
So around my 50th birthday, I gave myself the present of doing like the Writer's Way, class thing that like
Nice.
re-sparks your creativity, and wrote some really bad poetry, and then and then decided to try to write some fiction. Originally, I wanted to write romance for older people, and then decided I am far too jaded and bitchy to write romance. So now they're much more, I would say, women's fiction. Sort of the tagline is coming of middle-age stories for the jaded John Hughes generation.
Nice. I love that tagline. That is amazing.
So that's what I'm trying to write. The first book is written.
Okay.
The series-ish, I mean, their standalone series, is a group of 6 women in their 40s and 50s who have a board game night every month.
Nice.
So that's like the core story. But then probably there'll be maybe 3 books that will have one of the 6 as like the main character. And so funny, but real life problems. So like the first one is about the serious thread of Penny, who's also in this one, is that she figures out that her marriage is sort of dissolving, and she's become the people pleaser and stuffed all of her emotions with food. So she figures out she has a binge eating disorder, and so going through the process of like realizing that and then getting help and all those things. Well, that's the serious line of it, but there's lots of funny things.
Yeah, it is very John Hughes. It's very because he had that like situational comedy where it's like the topic is veered from mundane to serious, like detention after school or like something more serious than that, but then always those like coming of age issues, and then like bringing the comedy in by combining opposite personalities and putting them in interesting circumstances, bringing that like situational comedy around.
Yeah, there's definitely some situation. Like one of the key scenes is her on one side of a bathroom door and her best friend on the other side, where she has a captive audience and she's confessing all these things and her best friend's doing her colonoscopy prep.
Nice. So, yeah, that's that perfect.
Kind of, situation comedy.
That's awesome. I love it. Okay, so there's a couple things you wanted to talk about in your email, and I want to make sure you've already gotten the notes I sent you, so we can talk about those or not talk about those. You wanted to talk about like a comedy, and I want to talk to you about emotional transitions and what you're doing with emotional transitions. You wanted to talk about different voices and how to write different voices and make sure you have different voices. You wanted to talk about getting content into dialogue, which I'm going to call summaries, and we're going to talk about summaries. And then I want to talk to you about inner POV, like inner thoughts across multiple VOVs and how that works. So do you care where we start? Do you want to start? Is there anything else you want to throw in there to make sure?
I mean, I think I would add to summaries sort of like as an addition, that like when you're writing a book that is actually a second book, but a standalone book. So like, that whole story, and trying to figure out like how much of it you have to rehash in like the new book for the people who have not read the first one but then not summarizing, an entire book in 2 paragraphs.
Okay. So let's start there. Let's go summaries, and then we can go and we can end with character voices. Does that sound okay? Sure. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to share my screen just so we can look at your text. Sure. Okay. So several things I want to tell you that I loved right off the bat, that you're doing really, really well. Because when we edit, we always tell each other what needs to be fixed. We never say like, hey, this is great. First off,
it's a first draft. It's a first draft,
but it's great. First off, you're super dialogue driven, right? Like each scene is a conversation, which is perfect, right? Like even if there's only one character in a scene, it's got to be it's got to be conversational, meaning there has to be a give and take with the world around them. And you are totally doing that. It's great. It's super smooth to read. It's really nice, which I know is part of the genre you're writing in. It's got to be smooth to read. It's really smooth to read. And I could feel the pain of the characters. So you've got good, and I could hear the different personalities. So you're well on your way to strong character voices. So those are the things that I'd say, like, hey, you're really crushing this. There's things we can do to I think round this out. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So let me find a summary real quick so we can talk about what we're
There's many, just pick one.
There's many. Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna cut them all. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. So here's your first one here. She'd known Charlie, formerly Charlotte, for years, and through still adjusting to fit. Wait, did I hit record? I did. Okay. Sorry. I had a panic.
It says recording.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please don't make me do this again.
It's been one of those days. We got to start all over from the beginning. Yeah. She'd known Charlie, formerly Charlotte, for years, and though still adjusting through physical changes his testosterone therapy was bringing about, he'd never seemed happier. A reminder that the road less traveled can bring joy. Is this from a previous book?
No, Charlie's a new character.
Okay, so this is a summary. This is an example of a summary.
Okay.
And what you have a summary when you're describing something that pulls us out of the intimacy of the action.
Okay.
So if you think about your scene as your reader walking through a forest, right? And they can smell the wind, and they can touch all the trees, and they can like feel the crunch of the leaves beneath their feet, and they can, see the leaves rustle, right? Like it's that intimate experience of walking through the woods. A summary takes that reader and rips them out and brings them at the like 10,000 foot level where they're looking down on the whole forest. So there's positives and negatives to this, right? Like summaries are great reflective moments. They slow down the action, right? Like they make us go like, oh, that's interesting, right? Like summaries can be very awe-inspiring, right? Like we're getting the whole picture, right? Like you think of like the opening of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times, right? Like this big awe-inspiring opening 3 pages that are just this giant summary of the world intended to like refresh your mindset and get you into a setting, right? That's what summaries are really great at. But the conversational piece that comes right before this: morning, Willa, you clocking in or clocking out? Willa closed her notebook and looked up at who's asking. Morning, Charlie, clocking on. You? Clocking out, thank God, tapered off, but what a doozy of the night shift. This is intimate. I'm walking amongst the trees. I feel like I'm in the room with Charlie and Willa. And this has energy to it. So when you're in the forest, when you're in these like intimate scenes, you can feel the energy building between the characters, because what our scenes are exchanges between the characters that are present, right? Like, so as the characters exchange expectations and emotions, the energy of the scene builds. Does that make sense? So you're following me with the difference between intimate and summaries. So
no, that makes sense. And I think what I was first draft trying to do there was sort of that secondary character theme stated.
I don't want you to stop writing them in your first draft.
No, I know. Yeah. So like the reminder that the road less traveled can bring joy is sort of one of like the themes of the book.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that
maybe not the best way to introduce it, but that was sort of where it got thrown in.
That sentence is great, right? Like putting that sentence in. When you write your first draft, Maggie, you got to write whatever comes naturally. You got to get it out. But what I do want you to do is in your second pass, I want you to recognize like, oh, I have a summary here. And the minute you have a summary, you either need to get it out of the conversation so it doesn't slow the conversation down, or you need to make it part of the conversation, meaning they need to talk about this. So maybe Willa's like, hey, is that a 5 o'clock shadow I see? And Charlie can be like, yeah, check it out. Like, look. And Willa's like, how are the hormones making you feel? And Charlie's like, they make me a little nauseous. And I got a blister in my mouth, but it's worth it.
Got it.
And then you can put this line, maybe in Willa's inner thought, right? Charlie's a beautiful reminder that the road less traveled can bring joy. Right? Like, and get that in there. But if you put this piece, the summary piece in the conversation, you're keeping me engaged, you're building the energy, and you're not ripping me out of that forest. Does that make sense? Another summary. At 16 weeks, she'd be, no, that's not summary. That is summary, but it's okay because you're like giving us details. Oh wait, here's one. No, this is one. I do want you to put this into the conversation. At 16 weeks, she was barely showing and not ready to tell her boss, right? Light duty would be bandied about. So you're talking here about Willa being pregnant and not willing to tell her boss yet. I would keep this in the conversation. And the way I would do it is I would have Charlie ask her, like, how are you feeling today? And using her inner thought to being like, I feel like I got to puke. But then using her stuff to be like, I'm great, I'm good, like, everything's great. And then you can tell me like, 16 weeks, she's barely showing, but she's not ready to tell her boss yet. And then keep the rest of this in the conversation, right? Like, well, things are pretty crazy today, right? No light duty for you. Like everything's going to be in and out. And so then down here, her friend Penelope having found her heaving her guts out when they were waiting for coffee last week, the rest of the Triple G game night crew would be told this weekend that since she was hosting, she felt comfortable on her own turf. This feels like information from a previous book. Is that what that is?
Yeah.
I'd work it into a conversation with Penelope. So a lot of times when you find these summaries in your second round, you're going to have to look at them and be like, okay, where else in the book can I put this? Because you may not be able to keep it here. Sometimes what I'll even do is I'll keep I write in Word. So I'll keep a Word document that's just like crap to fit in other places. And I'll just cut it and I'll just put it in that Word document. And then as I'm editing and reviewing, I'm like, okay, I got to work this in somewhere. But you want to keep it in the conversation because you can see how like you start to build my energy here. Mm-hmm. And I'm getting excited. I'm into Charlie. I'm into it. And then you cut me off.
Right.
And now you're pulling me back up to that 10,000 foot level. And then I get a hit. I'm back down to the forest. And now I'm back up at the 10,000 foot level.
Fair enough.
Right? And I'm sitting
I might be able to cut that whole thing because actually the next scene after these 3 introductory scenes is that party that she hosts at her house. So I probably don't even need it if we're going to jump into it that quickly.
Well, and Penelope's anal, right? Like, and that's the other thing is you don't need to give me everything up front. So especially in the second novel, like I don't need to know. It's good to know that she's pregnant because it's impacting her job. In the opening, she's like reflecting on being pregnant. That's important, right? Like that's all stuff that we need. But I don't need to know that Penelope knows until I've actually met Penelope.
Okay.
So you might start off that scene with Penelope being that like OCD. She's going to show up early and she's going to be like, how are you? Are you okay? Right. Have you thrown up again since last week? Are you okay? Like, and I'm fine. It's fine. Everything's okay. It's no big deal, right? It's no big deal. I don't even know what I'm going to do with it, which is something she says later in the conversation, right? Like, so having that, like, but putting this paragraph in there to work into their conversation.
Makes sense. Well, and we know Penelope knows because she texts her later and Penelope obviously knows, right? So I don't need to tell them that Penelope knows.
Yeah. And this like frack I'm hosting, I want that in a conversation. I want Penelope to say like, are you ready for everybody to come over? And her like, I'm hosting, right? Like, and this is where your comedy is going to come, like throwing these very different characters into a situation and having them respond to one another, right? Like if you think about how, improv works,
right?
Which is very much that John Hughes comedy that you're going for. If you think about how improv works, what you're doing is you're putting characters on stage together, giving them different personalities, and then watching what happens through the exchanges with each other. And that's where like the kind of magic happens is in that like give and take between the characters. So we want all of this stuff in the conversation. Does that make sense? So in my second,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, so at least from what I've read, I mean, it seems like the key of comedy is an earnest first, and then the reaction is actually the funny part, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
To some extent. Like
to some extent. That's a great pattern to follow to start off, right? Like an earnest engagement, and then the follow-up to it ends up being, and a lot of times in that kind of setup, what the follow-up is what the reader is thinking already, right? Like you're just saying the quiet part out loud, and that makes it funny.
Gotcha.
A lot of times, like in John Hughes comedy specifically, he'll have a character that just says the funny part, that says what everyone's thinking out loud. Yeah, I'm thinking of 16 Candles. That's John Hughes, right?
Yep.
Yeah, you've got the like dumb junior high guys at the prom running around that all are just, they're just saying, or they're freshmen, I can't remember, but they're just saying the quiet part out loud the whole time. And that's what brings the comedy around, right? Like the hot girl is like, drive me home, and the kid's like, right? Like, and that's the funny part, is that like he's saying what everyone is thinking out loud.
Well, hopefully this will be a little more politically correct.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm not trying to be John Hughes.
No. This is a style. Yeah. We don't need to repeat. Yeah.
Where I'm aiming it at that generation who, like, some of their sensibilities were shaped by John Hughes movies, which is
100%. Yeah. Here's another summary.
Yep.
You can always spot them because they're paragraphs, and you're doing this nice thing. And right before you do one, you space down for us, so we can find it. You'll find them super easy on your second pass. You're like, oh, look what I did there. So as if summoned, the second call was her divorce lawyer with the latest offer from Ian, her almost ex. Washington was no false state. Despite publicly exposed affair with a coworker, the only thing helping her with negotiations was Ian's guilt, which was eroding as fast as the Pacific shoreline. Great line, by the way. His current offer was to either pay the mortgage for 2 years while she gathered the money, or buy his half out and pay the full ride of Olivia's. I need this whole conversation.
Okay.
I want to see this. I want to hear the lawyer. I want to watch her interact with the lawyer. That's going to teach me something about her. It's going to inform me about how she actually feels about Ian, right? Like the thing about summaries is they're so reflective. We don't get the intimacy of actually knowing the characters, right? Like it is that like telling and not showing.
Yeah. So again, that's like content from the previous book that I'm trying to like.
No, we love it. Give us the lawyer, right? Like, let us see him. Let us have his voice. Let us see her interact with the lawyer, right? Like have him tell us this, right? Like the second call was the divorce lawyer for me, and I need a phone call. I need her picking up the phone. I need him saying like, I need him maybe jumping right into it. All right. So I looked into the rules, and she can be like, hi, hello. I'm, who is this? And he's like, who this is, right? Depending on how you're going to structure his voice. Yeah. But like jumping right into it, and then have him tell us like Washington's a no fault state, right? Like I figured it out. So that kind of like getting this out through conversation is really going to empower your reader to feel positive about your character. So
really makes sense.
This is what I want all your summaries to look like. That's what I want. Simon, is that Penny? Put her on speaker, dear. Simon's mother walked into the room bellowing, even though she was now 2 feet from him. This is hysterical, right?
She just froze.
Oh, did I freeze? Tell me when I'm back. Am I back? Am I back? Am I back? I'm not back.
I lost you, Jeff.
Oh no.
Staring blankly into the
Yeah, that's right. This is what happens. Me frozen on the screen somehow, like. Yeah. Okay. So what I want is this back and forth, right? Like Simon is that Penny put on her speaker, put her on speaker, dear. Simon's mother walked into the room bellowing, even though now 2 feet away from him. This is hysterical. Simon's trying to talk to his sister Penny, and the mother's in the background yelling things. This is great comedy. And this is what I want. That when you look at a summary, right? Like you can see that I'm pulled back. You're telling me what's going on. I'm distant, but here I'm in it, right? Like, and I'm feeling it. So this is what when you look at a summary, I want it to look like this. Does that make sense?
No, makes total sense.
Yeah. And all of this too. These are great details about their life, about who they are. Work them into this conversation. right? Like get them talking about these things. And if you can't get them talking about it, the reader doesn't need it. If they can't get it out in inner thoughts or in the conversation themselves, the reader doesn't need it. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions about how you're going to edit your summaries?
No, I mean, yeah, except for feeling like I don't have, like the actual talent yet to do that, but you learn by doing, right? So.
Yeah. So what I want you to do when you start a summary is I want you to look at the summary and I want you to think about this as writing it more like a screenplay.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing you're allowed to write when you're busting out a summary are what the characters say. That's it. That's going to force you to get that in there. Does that make sense? It's going to force you.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And if you can get everything into the conversation, right? Like you'll be able to come back and add that like texture, those emotional details that really flush it out and make it feel like a novel. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want you to try. I know now I don't want to mess with your first draft, right? Like do your first draft how you're going to do your first draft. But when you come back for your second draft, pinpoint these summaries and turn them into conversations, because you actually have two full chapters here of material, maybe
if
3
they were fleshed out. Yeah.
If they're fleshed out. If you flesh out the conversation with Charlie, right? You flesh out the conversation you've got Penelope in her garden, which is great. I love Penelope in her garden. You then have Willa and Penelope texting back and forth. Also a great conversation, right? Texting back and forth was really fun. But then you have her brother Simon, and you have the lawyer, and then you have the phone conversation with Simon. So 6 conversations in here that all need to feel like full scenes. So you probably have 2 full chapters here once you flesh it out, maybe 3.
So out of curiosity, side note, would you switch it so the lawyer conversation came first so that then her conversation with Simon could then roll into his side of the conversation?
It's an interesting, you just got to feel it out. I'd write the lawyer conversation where it is, and then after you've written it and you're happy with how it sounds, then I'd do that.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk. Do you want to talk inner POV, or do you want to talk building different voices?
Either. I mean, I'm happy. What makes most sense?
Let's talk voices first.
Okay.
I'm gonna pop this up. Have you seen me talk about this before?
I mean, I've heard the podcast that you do about it and stuff.
Okay, great. Then we can skip this. What I want to say about it though is you've got really great personalities. So what we need to do is we need to define that voice that is the expression of those personalities. Have you done any kind of like voice work on these 6 women?
Some, probably not enough, because I didn't even discover you until after I'd written the first book.
Okay. So this is we're going to do this quick and dirty. Okay. So what we're going to do is now I have you can go to the site and download tools to do this with. This is actually how I do it. I don't, because I'm lazy, I don't download any tools. So if I'm going to do Willa, I'm just going to put her name. I'm going to go name. I'm going to go personality notes. I'm going to go words, which is the language and topic she's going to talk about. I'm going to do body language. I'm going to spell it right. Okay. Body language. I'm going to do cadence. I'm going to do pacing. So I'm just going to make 5 columns. That's really all I need, especially when I'm doing it for myself. I'm going to highlight all of these. I'm going to hit shift and I'm going to make them a little bit bigger, so I have some space. And then I'm going to come over here to this handy dandy text wrapping button, and I'm going to make all the text wrap. And if you want to make it look pretty, you can make it look pretty. I usually don't when I'm working on this for myself. So I'm just let's go. Let's get it done. Because look, we got to do this fast. So talk to me about Willa's personality.
So Willa is guarded. I mean, she's a trauma nurse in an emergency room, so she always has to be on. And then her secret like stress reliever is she dresses up in costumes and goes to conventions being anonymous.
Okay.
So she's best with a role. Like she likes being the nurse or all these things. She doesn't do great being like vulnerable to be herself. Yeah, so she's
How does
pretty.
she, besides putting on a role,
Yeah.
how else does she avoid vulnerability?
She tends not, like, she'll talk deep about subjects that aren't about her, but not subjects about her. Like, people don't know much about her history or why she's 42 and has never been married or has never been pregnant or had kids,
Gotcha.
But they'll know her opinion on, the houseless population that she's working with in the emergency room, right?
Gotcha. So she shares opinions, just not personal details.
Yes.
If you were to meet her at a party, how would you describe her in a couple words?
Yeah. Geeky to some extent. I mean, like her house is full of funky, Miyazaki film memorabilia and
Gotcha.
nerdy geeky.
Okay.
So yeah, it tends to talk in like saying frack, like right, like her language is often sort of built from the culture a little bit.
Gotcha.
And part of that is a shield, right? Because then she's,
Sure.
right.
How else would she be fun or serious?
So I think she would swing. So when she's got her work hat on, she is 100% serious.
Gotcha.
Okay. Because she is literally dealing with life and death and sort of likes it. I mean, doesn't like that people die, but like, has that adrenaline junkie junk in.
Okay.
But tends to only have fun when she's not herself. So that's sort of why the dressing up is, because like she feels like she can be more herself in a costume, which is sort of counterintuitive, but
okay. So when I'm doing this, when I'm coming up with voices, I will do this for myself. I'll just be like, okay, who's here? Is the first book published?
No.
Okay. So, well, I'm asking you because it'll change your process if it is.
It's being queried, but probably eventually will get self-published.
Okay. It's the life as an author. Being queried, but so are 10 million.
Well, I'm going to query it until this book is done, and then I will just be like, all right, let's just do it.
So I asked that because the process of writing a second book will be different if the first book is already published. But since we've got freedom, let's talk about designing these voices. So I'll do this with myself, right? Like I'll just pop open a spreadsheet like this, and I'll just ask myself, especially at the first starts of a book, like you're doing right here, I'll just be like, okay, who is this character? And those are the questions I always ask. I'm always like, what are they like? Right? Like, what defines them as a person? And then I'll ask, like, if I met them at a party, what are they like at a party? Right. And the reason that I use those two questions is because the first question gets a lot into like how I feel about, their wound and their persona. They're like, what are they like? As an author, I tend to answer like deeper. What are they like? But if I ask like, what are they like at a party? I'm getting first impression. Right. Like,
and there are 3 parties that she attends in the first book. So I can tell you pretty clearly. So she's very much the, I don't know if you've ever seen Moulin Rouge, but I always think of the song, like, I only speak the truth. Like that is her. Like they're going to like banter things. And then she's going to be like, yeah, he's a bitch boy. I mean, like, she's going to end the conversation with her, like one jab sharp comment. And they're like, Willa, but she's not usually wrong. She just,
So she says the things that no one else is going to say.
Yeah, often.
Nice.
Again, about other people, not about herself, but she doesn't, she doesn't play nice, but she plays truthful.
Yeah. So these are all things I'm putting under words for you, because words are like the topics that they talk about. Right. So not nice, but truthful. And then you have geeky in there. So we need her talking about that stuff, talking about things she loves. I work with some adorable nerds, and like, and I say the word nerds in the best
No,
sense,
of course.
in a good sense. Like they love Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
So if I ask them how their weekend was, I'm getting a tutorial on Dungeons and Dragons. So for Willa's voice, right, you have this opening scene of your second book where you are introducing us to her for the first time. We meet Charlie right here. There is nothing in this conversation that would tell me that Willa is a geek, right? But all there needs to be is Charlie being like, hey, how was your weekend? Oh my gosh, I saw the best. Have you seen the blah, blah, blah by Kurosaka movie? And Charlie would be like, no. And we'll be like, well, oh, it's so great. This is what's up. You got to see it. You got to see it. You got to go see that thing. It's amazing. You're going to love it. And Charlie's going to be like, I don't watch movies that you recommend. Right? Like that kind of like.
Well, some of that is, though, in my mind, like, they don't know that she has this secret life. I mean, I think some of it would bleed through, certainly.
Sure. And that's a character choice you're making. But I'm just saying, like, we want to line her voice up to let the reader know, no, this is part of her personality. Right? Like this is
makes sense. Like her friends would know that because they've been to her house and she has an entire room where she makes costumes and
but we don't want it to be like, we don't want to hide it in her room. We want to show it in her voice.
Gotcha.
Because remember, most of your interaction is going to come through characters talking. So we got to put it in her voice if you want the reader to know about it. What you don't want to do to the reader is surprise them in a bad way, right? Like, yes, we want to surprise the reader all the time, but we don't want to surprise the reader unintentionally, where the reader's suddenly like, wait a second, she's a nerd into cosplay? That doesn't, like, that's out of nowhere. Like, you don't want to do that to the reader. So you want to start.
And that makes me think that the first paragraph isn't working then, because the whole point is that she was dressed as Buttercup and, hooked up with Dread Pirate Roberts in a closet at a convention.
No, it works great up here, but then she's a totally different person here.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So you're saying switch.
We need that voice to carry through. And if she is that in one line here, but then in the next 5 lines, which is the only conversation you give me with her, but if you expand this into a full conversation, we say like the next, 30 lines, she's not that. I'm going to forget that this was her.
Gotcha.
This is who I'm going to remember. Sense. Right. Like, so we want to get that presentation out there so that she's talking about the cosplay things she loves, because there's no danger. Now, she doesn't have to say, I went to a cosplay party and dressed up as somebody else, but we do need to know that, like, she's into movies. She's into like things that she's willing to talk about, right? Like, specifically, as you're describing her, things that relate to like social justice that she's also passionate about, right? Like those things coming together, right? Like making, because something like geeky nerds who are opinionated do is they make recommendations. This is something we need her doing, right? Like, now, when you described her, you didn't give me any specific body language. So I'm just going to leave it blank. If you don't have any, you also didn't tell me like she talks a lot or she talks a little. So I'm just going to leave it blank. But you did say like she ends the conversations with sharp jabs and she's not afraid to like jump in, maybe interrupting to insert her opinion. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think she tends to talk in fairly short sentences. I mean, because it is sort of that direct.
Perfect.
She asks a lot of questions because she doesn't want to answer questions, right?
Yeah. So questions are a weapon to keep the conversation off of you. Uses questions to divert the conversation from her.
Partly, like, I envision characters as feelings, like not as.
I love that.
Well,
I love that.
I think you and I are, aren't we strengths twins? Isn't your 1-2 like strategic individualization?
It is, yeah.
And mine's individualization strategic.
Yeah.
It's that individualization thing.
Yeah. Seeing each one is unique. No, I love the feelings idea. What feeling is Willa to you?
brave and terrified at the same time.
Nice. That's real. Brave on the outside, terrified on the inside.
Yeah, and so the one POV you didn't get is her internal world as she's writing a diary to Dear Buttercup, which is a diary to the unborn baby. And that is really all of her, more like a first person, like she's writing her internal feelings. So like her POV is more like how she's acting. And then in the little thing, she's like, okay, I'm scared to death. And how am I going to protect you? And, you know, all those things. So I
think that's great. Okay, so we've done this for Willa. I would definitely do this for all of your POV characters. Okay. We've done it for Willa. Let's do it for Penelope. What's she like? And
she's in this book, she's like the catalyst secondary POV character.
Sure.
She's in transition. So in the first book, she was always all about making everybody happy. And so this book is about her figuring out how to make herself happy. So she's, you know, like in treatment for this disorder. She's in the middle of a divorce because she finally stood up to herself, stood up for herself. So for me, she's very motherly. She adores her daughter who just went to college. She's
motherly with her friends too.
Yeah, definitely.
Nice.
Which is sort of why her part in this. So like the big dark moment for Willa is going to be she gets postpartum depression. So that'll be the serious line.
Yeah.
When she can't figure out like how to, because her world is so dangerous. And then suddenly she has to protect someone in a dangerous world, right?
Yeah.
So she actually leaves the baby with Willa or with Penelope and bolts. Like that's the dark moment.
Yeah.
So that's part of why Penelope has to make a decision because she's so motherly, but she's trying to not be that, to like maybe not just jump in and be what people need her to be.
How does she feel about it when she fights against it?
Oh, like she's horrible and like she's hurting people and yeah, like it's totally against her nature, but her nature has not served her well necessarily. Okay.
So in this book, she's kind of defined the fact that she's pushing against her nature.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Like Simon, the brother, like wants to move out of his mom's house and move in with her. And so she's pushing up against that because she's finally like liking living alone. Right? Gotcha. So she's sort of learning what it looks like when she's not something for everybody else.
Gotcha. Okay. So her words, how does she sound? You tell me, what does she talk about?
Her words, she always says, she's like the opposite. Like she will just, people tend to have to like cut her off and she like embarrasses herself and says the wrong thing. Pretty wordy. Yeah, I mean, she's learning to try to not do that, but self-conscious. I mean, she's just so self-conscious.
How does that self-consciousness sound?
Like she's trying to explain why it's okay for her to talk about a subject sometimes. Like, really, I do know like something about it, or, sharing her personal experiences of, trying to help people. I mean, it's very focused on like, here's one thing you could do. So not pushy for advice, but definitely like wanting to explore with people how to help them, whether or not they want help.
Okay. So part of what I'm doing is I'm writing out this chart is I'm listening to you talk and I'm picking out the phrases that are sound phrases. Yeah. That are phrases about like how she sounds. Does that make sense?
Oh, and she doesn't. So that's what's hinted at this. So in the first book, she doesn't swear ever. And there's a reason for that. So like every fake swear word you could think of is in the first book. So that's one of her quirks. But
I love it.
She's starting to like learn how to swear because it's just always been ingrained in her to like be proper. And she feels like if she causes any trouble, she's causing them harm to have to deal with her trouble.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to, so it's like, she doesn't like creating anyone else have to be inconvenienced by her. So she's starting to learn.
Is she apologizing a lot?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I don't know where that comes from. Probably me.
So you can already see
that you
have two radically different voices.
Right. And they're opposite journeys. So one is like didn't want to be pregnant, is now pregnant. And the other one is like motherhood was her whole life. And now she's actually phasing out of motherhood. And so that's sort of their cross.
How do you feel about this kind of like defining the voice?
Oh, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. Body language is probably my worst because they are truly floating brains. Like I'm not very good at reading people.
No, then ignore it. If it's not natural, ignore it. If it's not natural, just pass by it. And you don't need it, right? Like you've got very different words that they're using, like very different topics they're bringing up, how they're talking. You've got different cadence in what they're doing, and you've got very different pacing and how they're interacting with the group. So you don't necessarily need body language. I'd throw it in to convey emotion, right? Like early in the piece, you have Willa, her hand unconsciously moved to her belly at the thought. That's a great use of body language to convey what she's feeling, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd keep your body language there. Talk to me about how you're doing your first draft. Are you just vomit drafting? Are you like plotting it out first? What are you doing?
I usually know what I want to start and end the emotion as, and like maybe a plot point or two, but mostly just vomiting it out. Yeah.
Okay. So when you come to your second, after you vomited it out, when you come to your second draft, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to read your POV characters chart.
Okay.
Take 2 seconds and read it. Just be like, okay, this is who Willa is, just to get Willa in your head, right? And then you're going to come back, and as you read Willa's voice, you're going to make sure she sounds like Willa, especially since we're going to take these 5 lines and make them 30 lines.
Right.
You're going to make sure that she sounds like Willa.
Maybe 15.
Maybe 15, maybe 45. So we're going to make sure that like when she's talking, she sounds like Willa talks. We're going to make sure that the topics she's focusing on Charlie and how things are going with Charlie, that she's not afraid to share her opinions on things, make recommendations about things. We're going to make sure her sentences are short, that she's using questions to divert conversation from her. So you might want Charlie to start off the conversation and be like, hey, how was your weekend? And her being like, good, how was yours? Right? Like, and flipping that back right away. Right. And we want to make sure that she's not afraid to interrupt and that she's throwing some jabs in there as she talks. So as you edit through her conversation, keep her voice in mind and make sure she sounds that way. Then when you get down to Penelope, and I would go and read Penelope's, right? And then come back. So getting 2 of these characters in took us, maybe 15 minutes.
Right. No, that makes total sense.
And so I would just do it yourself, get your characters in, and this will be your first big step into making these characters sound different. If you'd already published the first book, we'd have to have a conversation about getting over the fact that they're going to sound different in the second book than they do.
Well, and that's one of the things I'm trying not to do. Is I really want to focus on this one and not fiddle with the first one. Like it keeps making me want to go fiddle.
No, do not fiddle. Finish this one. Finish this one, but you will go back. This is part of like I really love when I wrote my first series. Nobody told me write the whole series before you publish something. And I wish somebody had grabbed me and told me that, because my voice has changed through the first. I wrote 5 books and the voice has changed through the 5 books, and I felt like I got my lead character Mencken. I got him in book 3. In book 3 I was like, oh, I know Mencken now. And that's going to happen. You're going to write book 2 and you're going to be like, oh, I know Willa now at book 2. And you're going to have to go back into book 1 and edit her voice. But that's the beauty of holding these books until you have multiple of them written, is that you start to get the character voice and you can make that more artful piece. Okay. How's it going to feel to go back on your second pass and edit these voices? What are your concerns about that?
No, that totally makes sense. I mean, I think plot tends to develop as I go. So I tend to ignore everything until I finish and then go back to the beginning, because I am definitely a tinkerer. Like nothing's ever I'm always going to see what's wrong with something. That would be what Becca says I do too. Like nothing's ever going to be good enough. So like I could tinker on one thing forever. So like I will take all this advice and try to use it moving forward, but I probably won't go back to this until I've like finished the first draft of the whole thing.
Yeah, it depends what kind of draft you want to do. Like I know you're part of Rachel Herron's crew, and I know Rachel is highly recommends get your entire first draft out before you tinker with anything. I can't write that way. I've tried and I'm like, but I can't do it. I got to finish a scene before I can move on to the next one. It's all about keeping you writing. Whatever you need to do.
I often don't write in order, which is not a good thing, but it still happens.
It is what it is. Look,
it is what it is.
Writing is hard enough. You got to do what works for you. At some point though, you are going to have to come back and take out these summaries and edit these voices.
Yeah, for sure.
I think your voices are like what you have going for you is you have really fantastic differentiation of personality. Where you're losing voices is when when you actually write a conversation, your characters start to merge. They start to sound like each other, which is super common in a first draft. That's where you're going to have to come and pull them apart. So as you get rid of these summaries and you write more intimate in the moment scenes, you're going to have more of this voice merging, which is why I'm talking to you about like, hey, before you write your first draft, get the voice in your head. Just glance at Willa for 5 seconds before you write your first draft, because it'll keep if you can keep your POV voice strong, you can keep you'll save your time in your edit later.
Oh, that totally makes sense. That's great.
Let's talk for a second about inner thoughts. So inner thoughts are important for the genre you're writing in.
Yeah.
Right. Like your reader's going to expect them. So you need to have them. And I think using italics to set them apart is really smart. I know you're laughing at me because we're a newsletter. Like, no,
paragraphs of them, but yeah, I mean, definitely there are a lot of asides, like internal asides.
So you have to ask yourself as you're filling this out, this chart out, I would almost make a column for inner thoughts. And lay out when your character's having them and why.
Okay.
And that'll help you as you're writing note when they need to have them. Right. So like, for example, the character you're describing with Willa, terrified on the inside, brave on the outside, inner thoughts are going to come when she's uncomfortable.
Right.
But they're going to match her voice, right? They're going to be direct. They're going to be short. They're going to be interjecting in the middle of conversations. So going back to this conversation, you're going to rewrite with Charlie, where she says, "Morning, Willa, you clocking in or clocking out?" Willa closed the notebook and looked up for who was asking. "Morning, Charlie, clocking on. You?" "Clocking on, thank God. Tapered off, but was a doozy night shift." Right? I want Willa thinking here like, that's good. Right? Like I'm up for a doozy. Right? This is where you can take this paragraph down here about not wanting to tell her boss and what she wants and work it into that thought. Better a doozy than a light shift.
Right? Like, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, keep me busy. Keep me from thinking about the what did you call them?
yes. The red-nosed inordinate size. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. So putting that, like working that in here in her inner thought, but you know that whenever she's like processing how she feels about something, because she's terrified on the inside but brave on the outside, you want to put that processing in her inner thought.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So on the other hand,
she doesn't really know she's terrified on the inside, but she is. Like, I mean, it's
but she doesn't
self-realization.
She doesn't need to know it. And that's where inner thoughts become beautiful in the paragraph, is that you're showing the reader that she's terrified on the inside without having to tell us, by using that convention of inner thoughts. For Penelope, on the other hand, though, see, I didn't do my little fancy make that column loop. For Penelope, on the other hand, though, right, you've got this like her questioning herself all the time. So inner thoughts are going to be that like questioning of herself.
That and the snarky thing she's never brave enough to say out loud. That's sort of the other thing. Her inner thoughts are a lot.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't tend to want to, say something that's gonna, make someone uncomfortable, but doesn't mean she doesn't think them.
Yeah, and you're gonna have to balance that because you're writing a character in transition. So she's going to have to, when she says something out loud, her inner thought's going to be like, oh, Penelope, right? But when she wants to say something out loud, like, yes, mom, I know, putting that in the inner thought and being like, that's really great advice on her exterior thought, right? So but you can see how the inner thought is going to match the character voice.
Right.
And you're using it as a shortcut to get out what you want the reader to know about the character's personality. Does that make sense?
No, totally.
Yeah. So I would go ahead and think about that. And again, before you write a draft for one of these characters, take 5 seconds and read this so that you know, hey, here's this POV, and then you can go write, and you'll nail. It's going to save you a ton of time editing, right? Like you'll nail that at POV every time.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about inner thoughts. Emotional transitions.
Yeah. That's the one I kicked back on.
Yeah. Which is great. So let's look at this opening paragraph. She was trying to write a want ad for the personal section, but was finding it difficult. She didn't think "I'm pregnant with your cosplay creation" would be an incentive for a masked man in black to reply, "Let's hook up again." Although if he offered, she wouldn't be against it. Sorry, those were my edits, but I can't read past the red anymore. Her hand unconsciously moved to her belly at the thought. So I said, this is moving too fast. And you were like, no, I want emotional complexity.
Well, so I actually talked this over with a couple of friends.
Oh, yeah?
Just out of interest. And I mean, I don't want to say it's not a gender or age thing, but like they were sort of with me that like we never have a thought that is not both like serious and funny. Like that's just like how we think all the time.
I totally agree. I love serious.
So it's sometimes sort of, it feels ingenuine in a way to not have both those feelings like back to back.
Oh, I'm not going to tell you to get rid of both of those feelings.
Okay.
I love serious and funny because you go back to funny right here. At least she knew it was him. His black masked handkerchief kept the identity of him a secret. The problem isn't that you have both emotions. The problem is that you're not spending enough time on either one.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Right? Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly at the thought. Feels like you just dropped me in a roller coaster ride. I just went to a valley and then you're skyrocketing back right up again to humor.
Roller coasters are fun.
But do you want your opening paragraph to make me nauseous? That's the question.
Fair enough.
Emotionally nauseous. So right here, give me 2 or 3 sentences.
Okay.
The complexity of emotion's great, but I need 2 or 3 sentences here so I can actually appreciate the complexity of emotion. Right now, you're just jumping in and out of it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, when you get into this conversation with Charlie, you're going to have to do the same thing, right? This idea or this concept of like a reminder that road less traveled can bring joy. We need to live with Charlie's joy to actually appreciate that thing.
Got it.
So that's one of the reasons I want you to break this into like a 52 line conversation.
It's getting bigger every time.
Because I need to live with Charlie's joy to actually appreciate the thought that Willa is going to have about her. Right. Otherwise, I'm going to read this and I'm not even going to remember that Charlie was joyful. I'm just going to fly right through it.
Makes sense. I mean, I think what I was not successfully doing. So in my mind, her thoughts are not congruent with her actions. So like her hand moving to her belly is like that internal, like, protective, even though her thinking is all about like very structured and.
That's great. Tell me how her hand moves to her belly. Give me a sentence about how that makes her feel. Let her rub it for a second before she moves back into like hard Willa.
Okay. Makes sense.
Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, but give me like 3 sentences to live in that emotion for a minute so that I can actually appreciate the complexity of what you're doing. Because right now, I'm just going to fly through it.
Okay.
I'm not going to see it. Yeah. I'm going to fly through it. I'm going to be like, oh, that was a weird dip. And I'm going to keep going.
Fair enough.
Right. So if you want me to feel something, you gotta live in it a little bit. That's true for positive emotions and it's true for messy emotions, right? Like it's like I tell my kids all the time, if your room's a mess, you need to go sit in it and how does it make you feel? And now you'll clean it. right? Like it's that kind of like, but we need to feel it. We need to feel how it feels so that we can experience it with the character.
And it originally had a joke about Dread Pirate Roberts and how she can only recognize him by his saber, but I took that.
I love that. That's great. Let her dwell on the belly for a couple minutes. Let her hold it there, and let her call it, like, let her rubber belly and be like little ROUSs, right? Like, yeah. And then make a line about the Dread Pirate Roberts, and maybe he'll bring his saber to the. If I don't tell him, maybe he'll come back and bring his saber to me again, right? Like, give me that joke, and that's a great transition out of the serious moment into the funny.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. We've talked. Anything else you want to talk about, or anything we didn't cover?
No, this has been hugely helpful. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're in the Slack, so if you're doing this stuff and you get stuck, just drop a note in there. I'm always around it. I'm not always fast. Sometimes it takes me a little bit to answer.
You have a life.
Yeah, I get distracted by like real life. I'd much rather just focus on the Slack all the time. But if you're doing what we talked about and you get stuck, just don't reach out, right? Okay. Like that's what the community's for, is for us to help each other through this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I so appreciate it. Like being a fairly newbie, it's like everything seems so overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
But
don't be. You're doing great. You've got complex characters. You've got wonderful conflict. You've got a good story to tell. Now it's just about getting your mechanics refined so that you can make the storytelling as simple as possible on you, right? So you don't get overwhelmed. And that's what it's like, in the end, as writers, there's an aspect of us that we're just car mechanics. And like at some point you'll start to feel your processes and start to feel like, okay, this is how I fix this car to make it run. And that's my goal for you, is that we can put some tools in your hands that just make the storytelling easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
There's no wrong way to do it. And you're off to a great start, just to encourage you.
Well, I really do appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and we can talk a little bit more.